Good job, Louise. So raise your finger, move it around, make sure it doesn't blend into your background so I can see it. If once a person is speaking, if they say something that you want to clarify, that means please explain what you meant by, I didn't understand a word you said. It is not a time to kind of make an argument by asking them a question. If you think that's what your question is coming from, then raise one finger and get on the list. And if the question asked is not a clarifying question, I'll let the asker know. We do maintain an atmosphere of safety and respect, no name calling, no tone, no eye rolling, no sidebars. And that is also why we ask everyone to be muted so that any background noise doesn't distract from the person speaking. But when you're on the list, you get 2 minutes and I'll keep a timer, which if you don't hear it, I will just say time and see if you want to get back on the list. And at the end, when we're getting close to having to give enough time for the final wrap up, I can't say exactly when that'll be, then I'll close the list and we'll go into the final wrap up. And at that point, anybody who has not spoken will get 2 minutes and everyone else will get 1 minute to give their final thoughts. Any questions? Marva, hi. I didn't even know I let you in. That's why I'm surprised. So I brought this article because it is the Saturday before Columbus Day, or the day that we should no longer be calling Columbus Day, call Indigenous Peoples Day. And because the ridiculous amount of coverage that was provided to one missing white woman really eclipsed all of the missing Indigenous women and girls that this article addresses. And that doesn't even get into the other people of color, girls and women of color who go missing, you know, for a variety of reasons into a variety of horrors. So I hope you'll really focus on sort of what we can do as a culture to like make the lives of women and girls who are not white as important to our culture as women and girls who are. And with that, the list is open. Marva? Bill? You're muted, Marva.
Oh.
Louise?
Before this article came up, I was doing research on Gabby, and it seems as though 71 Indigenous women were missing last year, and they didn't receive the coverage. All local station was carrying Gabby. The national news on every station, and I felt slighted because people of color don't receive that kind of coverage. Stars was coming out. They even have dog. I do think dog is coming out for his own reason to get TV time. But there's others that is well known coming out for Gabby. Thank you.
Thank you. Bill, you're next.
I found the article very illuminating. I knew most of the concepts, but it gave me details. And it reminded me the only people that are treated worse than African Americans are indigenous people. Because when the whites came here, they wanted African Americans for free labor. So, but they looked at the indigenous people and just saw they were weeds to be plucked so they could take over the land. And they just killed them all, for the most part. And it's just horrible aspects of the founding of this country, what white people did to both the indigenous people and other people of color, especially African Americans. And the same concept happens. Kamala Harris, when she became Attorney General, tried to correct the fact that the police, if it was an African American missing person, the police wouldn't invest any energy in it. And she tried to correct that. So a lot of parallels here, but it's horrible how we still treat our indigenous people. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Louise, you're next.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, the indigenous people are invisible, basically. I mean, they don't come on any radar in our society, which is extremely sad and disgusting. And the fact that, yeah, this country was founded on genocide, basically. So that's so sad. But the takeaway that I got from this article was that they have no jurisdiction on in their lands. You know, for like if a white person had committed a crime, they have no jurisdiction to arrest them. I didn't know that, and that surely would be the first thing to get changed. I had no idea about that. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. The list is open. I did want to say that I think it was in the book Braiding Sweetgrass that it was mentioned that the white settlers did try to enslave the indigenous people, but the difference between the Africans who were brought here and the indigenous people was the indigenous people had somewhere to run to and get protection and hide. They had family, they had communities. So that was attempted, but it didn't go over very well because they had refuge. Anybody else want to get on the list? Nancy? You can go ahead and I'll watch for other.
Okay. I just wanted to say that
Cindy.
it seems to be specifically blonde-haired, blue-eyed white women that get this kind of attention. Because even when you have brown-haired or brown-eyed or a darker complected white woman, they don't get the kind of attention that blonde-haired, blue-eyed white women get. Natalie Holloway, she dominated, still dominates. I mean, still is referred to in the media, and there are plenty of brown-haired women, white women that go missing, and they don't seem to get the attention either. So I think that it is a specific type, physical type, that gets this kind of attention. There's also, I've mentioned this before, I don't know if it's still on Netflix, but it was a show called Longmire that the backdrop or the backstory of this sheriff in Wyoming, which was actually filmed in New Mexico, was the story of indigenous people and the reservation and the horrible things that they go through being invisible in this country. The promises that the United States, the treaties that they make that and agreements that never come to fruition. The children who are, I wouldn't say they're stolen, but they take them from the parents and put them in foster care, and then they try to indoctrinate them or basically brainwash them into American life and take their culture away from them. And
Do you want to get back on the list?
well, I can try later. I don't have to be right now.
Okay, Cindy, you're next. Unmute. And the list is open, Marla.
I think this has
Pedro.
been going
Pedro.
on for a very long time. As long as I've been adult enough to pay attention to it. I'm curious whether there are organizations or how would one support the solution of it? Is there a group that's working to figure this out? Or just up to individual tribes, individual families? That's really tough. They need a lot more support to solve these. If people know they can get away with stealing, especially these young women, it's really horrible.
Thank you, Cindy. Next I have Marla and Pedro. Did I miss anybody? Okay, go ahead, Marla.
Yeah,
You put
so
me on the list.
Okay, Glenn,
after reading this, oh, and Bill
Bill.
too,
thanks.
this, I guess it just made me think even more about domestic violence in our country and how women who are victims of domestic violence, their struggles. And as a side note, if you haven't watched The Maid or read The Maid, I would highly recommend. I haven't finished it yet, but I'm on the last episode, I think. So it highlights domestic violence of a white woman, actually. And so Phyllis and I had kind of chatted offline a little about what would it be like, to be a woman of color in that same situation, and really lacking resources. I mean, the woman in the show does too, but just some of the other struggles that Indigenous women who are victims of domestic violence, for example, face. And I think the article highlighted how many of the women who have disappeared who are Indigenous are also likely victims of domestic violence with their partner, at the hands of their partner. And then I just also wanted to highlight, I didn't know and I was shocked, apparently 710 women, Indigenous women, disappeared from the same vicinity as Gabby Petito in the years 2011 through 2020. So, and I don't remember hearing hide nor hair of those women. I found that shocking and disturbing. And I don't know, it just is making me think more about domestic violence and what we can do to resource women, like what I can even do individually in my own community to assist those women more. All women, but especially women who are of color.
Thank you, Marla. I have Pedro next.
Yeah, that is really something that you'd have 700 apparently Indigenous women during that same period without a peep. And to Nancy's point, I just wanted to, that if it's a white woman, it gets the coverage. I think it just points very clearly. I mean, that saying to me that's really important in my life is that there's no such thing as a lesser human being. Either you believe that or not, but these facts speak for themselves. Obviously, there is such thing as a lesser human being. It's a non-white being. And that is evident not just in what this article talks about, but I've mentioned it before and I wanted to bring it up again, that in the 1980s, the Dallas Times and the LA Times, they did some really important work. This guy, David Brook, Great Areas in Colorblind Justice, in the LA Times in January of '84 said the taking of a black life, even by another black, was 1/10 as likely to be punished by death as the taking of a white one. Yet a black who took a white life was 5 times as likely to receive the death penalty as a white committing the same offense. The Dallas piece talked in 1988 discovered that Dallas County criminal justice system more severely punished killers and rapists whose victims are white than those that are Black or Hispanic. The rape of a white woman received a median term of 10 years, while if the victim was Hispanic, the term was 5 years and the median was 2 years if the victim was Black. So clearly, that's what systemic racism is. It's a dehumanizing of people by color, and it's just completely evident. And it's as shocked as we are, it's just buried outside of the news cycle. So thanks.
Thank you, Pedro. Next, I have Glenn with a G. Glenn? Glenn, are you there? Okay.
Oh,
there it
can
is.
you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I don't look at it as our justice system. I look at it as the entire American public, and including ourselves, how we view ourselves, and how the entire American society view us as less. The entire, and that includes some people who come from people who weren't born here. They come from India, or they may come from China. They are in the group that view others as less. And so the problem is not changing the justice system. It's changing the brainwashing that has been going on in America for centuries.
Thank you. Bill, you're next. And the list is open after Bill.
All of you who live in New Orleans are probably familiar with Chef Menteur Highway. You know what Chef Menteur means in French? Lying chief. And that was a term for our local indigenous people that they applied to the French. They were all lying chiefs. And that's how they were viewed, with good reason. I took heart that we might be moving a little bit with the Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland. I watched a ceremony where Joe Biden signed into law the re-expansion of Bears Ears, which is a sacred land to the indigenous people of the area, and another big space in Utah. And she was there, and every time I see her appear, she's always wearing the clothes of her tribe, which is in New Mexico. And but I was shocked, but not surprised, that the federal government prevents tribes from prosecuting non-native offenders on tribal lands. So non-white people can go into tribal land and do whatever they want to. The young girls are like open season, and there's nothing that can be done about it. That needs to be fixed. I also said that natives who commit felonies on tribal land follow under federal jurisdiction. There was a case that got blown out of proportion in Oklahoma where the judge ruled that half the state was indigenous, but it didn't mean that half the state was owned by indigenous people. It just meant that the cases that happen in those areas fall under federal jurisdiction. And the reason for this, a rapist lawyer used that trick to get, because his client was found guilty in the state court, and he used that trick to have the guilty thing thrown out because the Fed should have done it. And that's all that was. It was not anything more. It was not anything that was good for indigenous people.
Thank you.
I ran over.
Thank you, Bill. The list is open. Marva, you can go ahead. Anybody else? Okay, go ahead, Marva.
I lost track of the 1920. Oh, it was from last year, 2020. And it was between 2019 and 2020. There had brought before Congress the Vietnamese Human Rights Act. And I don't know, when I heard it, I heard you people, Black people, they didn't have a Human Rights Act. So the Vietnamese didn't build this country. We built this country. We have been here at the beginning of building the United States. Where are our Congress people? They don't think we deserve a Human Rights Act? Can anybody tell me, did it come to pass in it's an act that's being active? Thank you.
Thank you. Nancy, did you want to get on the list? If
No, I had a clarifying question. What is the Vietnamese Human Rights Act?
They are protected against crimes against their particular race, racist crimes.
Okay,
Okay.
clarifying question, Louise, for Marva.
So that's different from like a hate crime?
Yeah, particularly a hate crime. We don't have any hate crimes protecting us because the police wouldn't have free reign against Black people.
Okay, the list is open. Anybody want to get on? Lynn, go ahead.
I was looking at the Violence Against Women Act, which was not reauthorized for two reasons. 172 Republicans voted against it because boyfriends and domestic partners of women these boyfriends and domestic partners who have abused women, their partners, and who they're not supposed to have access to guns anymore. And so, oh my God, the NRA suddenly opposes the Violence Against Women Act. It's more important to let a domestic abuser go out and buy a gun or as many guns as he wants than to protect a woman who's being beaten up and who will possibly be shot with that gun. And then the other thing that the 172 Republicans objected to was that transgender women, trans women, were brought within the scope of the law, and they don't want to protect these women, and they don't want to even think about these women being sheltered in a place for abused women, because they shouldn't mix with women because they're really men, even though they identify as women, and even though they're being beaten and treated badly. So, and then another thing I saw, if I have any time left, is that the Violence Against Women Act does have a provision that gives tribes jurisdiction over non-native people who commit crimes on their land. The Violence Against Women Act also provides funding for all kinds of services that help women. And some of it is targeted more and more to Native women, women of color, people who have special problems getting help against violence. But the old National Rifle Association raises its ugly head again and totally distorts our society.
Thank you, Lynn. Perfect timing. The list is open again. Nancy, anybody else? Bill?
In the show Longmire, they address the issue too of sex trafficking amongst Native women. So perhaps some of the women who went missing, the 710 women, were actually taken to be in the sex trafficking trade. They provide them with drugs and get them addicted and take them into the sex trafficking trade. And there's a network all over the country that these women travel. And they just disappear and no one looks for them. They're not valuable to society, so they're not searched for or considered to be not valuable, and therefore not searched.
Pedro, I see you. Thank you, Nancy. Bill?
Yeah, I just to follow up what Nancy said, we treat indigenous people as invisible, is non-existent. The Taos Pueblo, we were there in New Mexico, which is a wonderful place. The Taos Pueblo is the oldest continuously habited city in North America. But you don't find that in the history books. And it's been habited for over 1,000 years. And also when the Spanish came, they tried slavery for a while. In fact, because there was an existing slavery, very minor modified slavery amongst the indigenous people. They were mainly,
Now, how you? Oh, I got press this. Yeah.
they were mainly prisoners of war. But the Spanish came in and they built on that to expand the slavery of the Southwestern indigenous people. But this is sad. I keep looking through, skimming this article, which is on my other screen, and just looking at these horrible things that we do. And so I hope with Deb Hyland, that may be some, she says that she's going to form a new missing and murdered unit within the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So hopefully that'll start to make a little bit of difference.
Thank you, Bill. Next is Pedro, and the list is open.
Am I?
Yep, you're next.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Let's go.
Yeah, so, I was, this impunity or whatever, that if an Anglo non-native American commits a crime on tribal lands that they're outside the reach of the law there, it's consistent with, which many of y'all may have heard, the International Criminal Court, that we're one of the few nations that withdrew from that. There's some 125 nations, I think, now. But basically, it was established in 2002 to fight impunity for the worst international crimes. And so kind of looking at that, this, you know, on the one hand, you have the open market to abuse minorities, particularly women, and really even women themselves. And while there is this impunity from prosecution or accountability, again, that's kind of the character of a nation that Dr. King would implore us to change. I don't know how we change it, but I do think that article is really powerful in pointing out this, you know, this double standard and this lesser status of some people versus other people, which is in complete contradiction to our Constitution. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. List is open. Anybody angry? Cindy. You're muted. Oh, God.
It's pretty obvious that we all feel the same way.
I'm gonna
But
mute and step
my
off because there's a,
What's being done about it? I don't get emails or letters about, you know, solve this problem. I don't know of groups that are working except police and maybe tribe. But how do we, who's the appropriate agency or individuals to work towards solving this? Because it's sort of this nebulous, everybody knows it and nobody seems to give a damn. It's very sad and makes me angry, but I have no one to write to, you know, stealer of women. That's not a good address. How do we work towards resolution? I don't know the answer, but it's pretty sad. Frustrating.
Phyllis, you're muted.
thank you, sorry. I ran away because there was a smoke detector going off in the hallway and I wanted to make sure there was no actual fire. So the list is open after Cindy and Bill and anybody else?
I think maybe why there's less conversation is just numbing. I keep skimming this article on my other screen and looking at what it says, and it's just numbing what we've done. But it's not surprising because this is what we've done to indigenous people since the beginning of this country. And we saw them as just obstacles to taking over the land. And FBI said there were 5,712 reports of missing Native women and girls, but the Department of Justice missing persons database only logged 116. So there's so many things to change here. And I know I probably talked more than enough, but I was just trying to keep the conversation going. But it's, I remember I quoted something from Walter Reed, who said that the white settlers came to this country demanding rights and to demand rights from the colonial powers. And indigenous people are born with a sense of responsibility to the earth, to other human beings. And that just sums up the difference right there. I have great respect for the indigenous view of the land. When they killed the buffalo, they would pardon the buffalo for killing it, but they would use every ounce of the buffalo for clothes, for food, everything. And they only took what they needed instead of to taking whatever you can get. There's a big difference between taking what you need and taking what you can get. And that's driving the massive income inequality in this country. I saw a special on that. You just saw an X of the percentage of wealth by low-income people versus the percentage of wealth by super rich. And this greed is just destroying our country. It destroyed the Native American, the indigenous people first, and now it's taking on the whole country. Thank you.
Thank you. Bill, Lynn is next. And Nora.
Sorry. I wanted to recommend a really good novel by Louise Erdrich. She is part Chippewa Indian, and she's written 29 novels from the Native American viewpoint. The Night Watchman received the Pulitzer Prize, and there are two strands in it. One is the night watchman who works in a factory and is working to prepare a petition to go to speak to Congress to have treaties honored and land restored to Native Americans. And that's based on her own great-grandfather. And the second strand is a missing woman who has been captured and put into the sex trade. But it's a wonderfully written book. And as I said, it won a Pulitzer Prize. And the second comment I have is to answer Cindy, who can she help? Where can she look for more information? And I was Googling and found the Indian Law Resource Center, because I think a key point is that Native Americans need to be in charge of the movement to repair the damage, to stop the damage from reoccurring, because they know how their society is organized and they know how the crimes have been perpetrated with impunity. They know better than anybody. And they have specialists who have studied the ways the law discriminates against Native Americans, that they can't expect equal justice in the courts, and they often do not even have jurisdiction. So I would suggest going to indianlaw.org, and they have a donate button, and they have, it looks like they have a whole lot of information here. And I will be looking at that myself. That's all.
Thank you, Lynn. You're really good at the 2 minutes. Next is Nora. Pedro, did you have your hand up to talk? No. Okay. Anybody else after Nora? Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I'm trying to persevere through my ignorance and my lack of being very articulate, but so I'm thinking about language, and back to what Lynn was saying about the reasons for not passing the Violence Against Women Act. And I would want to know what the language is in that law. I mean, is it really that we want men to be able to continue to have guns? We don't want to protect trans women. I want to know what the language is that would sound more palatable in being against that act. And then also, I think what Marla was saying about what we can do, I think about the language we use as far as violence against women, how we say a woman was raped rather than saying a man raped a woman. And the importance of focusing more on that than just the woman being the victim. And then the last thing I'll say is that the men are still in charge, and men are comfortable being in charge. And just like people that are Get so frustrated. So if you're comfortable, you're less likely to care about making changes. That's what I mean. And I think I'll end with that. Blah.
Thank you, Nora. That was very articulate. Lynn, do you want to clarify what you were saying about the Violence Against Women Act and sorry, what the act says versus what the Republican opposition says about
No, I don't want to.
it?
I haven't studied it enough. I just, it was an article that I skimmed briefly. And actually, there are other laws that provide that too. It's not just the Violence Against Women Act. So even if that were not in the language of the Violence Against Women Act, it would still be the law. But that's what the Republican opponents have focused on. Or what the NRA has focused on it, and then the Republicans, including Liz Cheney, are just in lockstep with the NRA. Whatever they say, they have to follow because that's what the base demands.
So the act wants guns to be unable to be sold to people who've been charged with domestic violence or violent crimes against women, and the law would include trans women as being protected. And those are the things the NRA and conservative Republicans do not want to vote for. That's, I think, does that help, Nora? Can you hear me?
Right. And I would just want to hear what the objections, why would you object to protecting a trans person?
Because they don't think that trans women are women. Right? They think they're really just men trying to get access to women somehow. Okay. The list is open. Anybody else want to get on the list? It's 10:54. We got more time to chat before we do wrap up. Oh, Michelle, good, go ahead.
I don't know about any of you, but when I read these articles, I can't help but go down to the comments and start reading what people have said about it. It's just my nature and how reasons I go on Twitter. But I'm just curious if anybody else has read some of the comments on the article, because that brings up some interesting things that I wonder how true they are. One of them was somebody was commenting about the statistic they quoted in the article about the number of non-native men who commit these acts against the women, how that's been documented. And somebody pulled into the comments and said that in Canada, where the same thing happens on Indigenous lands that have been set aside for them, and that actually I guess it was probably the Canadian Royal Mounted Police who did an investigation and found that actually the statistic was that the majority of the incidents were perpetrated by men of Native ancestry. And the reality is kind of flipped. So I wonder how true that is. One, because I always question what the police do as far as investigations are concerned. But secondly, the one of the motives behind that was that women were more often victims of domestic violence on these tribal lands, and they are, as human nature in such cases has been statistically proven to a certain degree here as well as everywhere when domestic violence is involved in the case, that the victim often does not want to see the perpetrator arrested or harmed in any way, and they defend that, and they deflect so that person does not come under any scrutiny. So it was just an interesting statistic that somebody pulled up there, and I certainly, I briefly did, and my mother also, who was not part of the social social work component, but worked for a domestic violence shelter in Dallas for a time during the 90s. And I worked there briefly over the summer as a summer job as a receptionist, actually in the shelter itself. And so kind of was around the environment, and of course picked up on the language and the treatment, logic and things like that, and certainly learned a lot that way. So I certainly have heard that is definitely a phenomenon among women of domestic violence, trying to protect their husbands or boyfriends. They don't want to see them go to jail. So interesting statistic from the comments in that article that just made me think and wonder about that. And how do you get to what the reality is and the truth is in this situation? Is it really a lot of domestic violence that we're facing here on these tribes, or is there a lot of sex trafficking going on? I mean, how do we get to the point where we can trust the investigations into the truth behind all this? It's kind of a quandary that I just thought I'd mention.
Thank you, Michelle. Louise is next, and then Bill and Lynn.
Michelle, that's when they do have investigations, right? So Roy made a good point that our conversations in these groups, Erace, whenever it is Indigenous people based, that the conversation seems to run dry a little bit. And I find that interesting because we are a group of obviously caring, compassionate people, I would like to think. And so what is it? Is it because our knowledge, because they are invisible, because the knowledge, because news reporting, because facts and figures, because just everything about Indigenous people is less at our fingertips and less on our minds, perhaps, that we have less to say about it? I just thought that was an interesting point, and I've found that to be true, that the conversation does seem to run dry when we're talking about Indigenous people.
Thank you, Roy. He's right. Thank you. Bill?
Thanks, Marla, for pointing out the comments. I'm reading them, and they're all the ones I've seen so far are racist. It says, Mofo Jackson says, okay, well, we live in a world where everybody's claiming to be a victim due to their race, sex, sexual preference. And then he goes on, there are many problems affecting different communities of color that have nothing to do with the evil white man. And then he goes on to talk about genocide in Africa, what the Aztecs did, and then says, why not indulge yourself with a bit of actual history instead of this nonsense about your supposedly racial and motivated oppressors that are holding you back in life. So this is just the typical reaction of people who want to deny what's happening. And these are a lot of the arguments that are made. Well, look what African Americans do to each other. Look what Hispanics do to each other. You know, it's the what about argument that a lot of Republicans resort to. So it's I will look at comments going forward, but I haven't seen a single comment that was positive towards the article so far.
Thank you, Bill. I've got Lynn next, and then the list is open.
I got a clarifying question.
Oh, for Bill?
Yes.
Yep, go ahead.
Well, Bill, isn't that true that many of the problems that African American have has nothing to do with the white man? Is that a true statement, or is that a lie?
I don't think that's a clarifying question. You're making an argument.
I'm happy to answer that, but he said, isn't it true? And I said, well, I think that's irrelevant because just because there are crimes, black on black crimes, doesn't excuse police brutality and white on black crimes. So it's the whataboutism that the Republicans or conservative almost always use. What about this? What about that? instead of admitting the truth. And the truth is that there's police brutality. The truth is that there's a lot of white on black crime. And the fact that there's
Marla.
black on black crime doesn't excuse it.
Okay, thank you, Bill. We've got Lynn and then Marla.
Well, people are not aware of, or do not pay attention to, do not consider it important to think about Native American people. But in fact, the intersection of race and sex, women are not important. I was reading an article that says the same cities that have protests for Black men abused by the police do not raise much of a fuss about Black women who are brutalized by the police. Let me see. When Jacob Blake was left partially paralyzed after a white police officer shot him in the back 7 times in Kenosha, Wisconsin, demonstrators flooded the streets in protest. But when former Oklahoma City police officer Danielle Holtzclaw was accused of sexually assaulting 13 Black women, these kinds of mass protests were nowhere to be seen. And it has a list of 5 or 6 Black women brutally assaulted by the police, and there were no social justice movements on their behalf. And yet George Floyd, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, and Trayvon Martin are household names. It's as if not only do the media not pay that much attention to crimes against people of color, but they even pay less attention against crimes against women of color. That's all.
Thank you, Lynn. I've got Marla next. Anybody else want to get on the list, or we'll do the wrap up after Marla? Okay, Marla, go ahead.
Lynn, you essentially said what was on my mind. I just think about the ongoing deflection that people use when they're talking about issues related to women, specifically women of color. Also, you know, the constant, well, if the woman didn't do X, then Y would not have happened. So the gaslighting and the deflection are very prevalent all of the time. And I just wanted to throw in, if you know, the thing about reading the comments that Michelle pointed out, I do that too. And I actually forgotten to do it this time around. So thanks for pointing that out, because, you know, if you really want to feel pissed off, just go ahead and look at the comments and you're sure to get fully riled up. Another thing that I follow that has been very eye-opening, but also quite infuriating on Instagram is a page called You Look Like a Man. I don't know if you all are familiar with it or if you've taken a glance, but this is a woman who is a power lifter, and she started this because she kept getting all of these men sliding into her DMs and saying horrific things, and, you know, talking about how off-putting she was when she responded with solid no's, and just all kinds of things, like the notion that women are looking for men's unsolicited opinion all of the time. And, you know, we're not, we really aren't. We didn't ask to hear from you, so you don't need to comment. And a lot of this page is really funny, but a lot of it is also very, very disturbing. And it just brings to light a lot of the things that I think we're talking about regarding these Indigenous women too. So maybe have a look at it, but yeah, you probably need to do it in small doses.
Thank you, Marla. So we can start the wrap up now, unless somebody else wants to get 2 more minutes of talking. So I'm going to change. I think everyone has spoken now. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think everybody did. Okay. So we'll do the final wrap up of your all's final comments for 1 minute each, and then I will say some closing thoughts. And then we'll do announcements. So I'm going to start with Glenn Abdullah. Glenn, do you want to do your final wrap up? Okay. We'll come back to Glenn then. Nancy, do you want to do your final wrap up?
I think that the reason we said the conversation gets kind of dry, one, we don't know a lot about what goes on in the indigenous communities, and that's intentional. There's not a lot of TV shows, like I mentioned one, Longmire, and that was moved from A&E to Netflix. I don't know of too many others that spotlight life in an indigenous community. So I think that's done intentionally. And then two, just like on the article that I did last week with exclusively white communities wanting to remove themselves from larger communities, I think that there is, if it's not my problem, I'm not paying for it. And I think that that's one of the reasons that the, the Violence Against Women Act meets such resistance. It's not my problem. I'm not paying.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lynn?
I'm sorry, I lost my portrait to unmute myself. I'm very hopeful that Deb Haaland, the new Secretary of the Interior, will put some structures into place to address this problem and also shine the spotlight on it so that when she's gone, we won't forget. It will be something that we know about. But unfortunately, it takes time to do this. And so several months have elapsed since she was appointed and we haven't heard anything. Maybe the Democrats need to hire some PR experts to get these issues before the public, even before new laws or new initiatives are taken, so we can all be thinking about them. A very thought-provoking article, and thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Michelle?
Yeah, I mean, definitely agree with everybody about Native Americans, indigenous people not getting the attention that because they are invisible. For sure. Just in my own personal relationship with that, since I do this radio show in Austin, it's called Civil Rights and Wrongs. My co-host and I have tried multiple times to bring up and bring attention to Native American issues. And I must say that it has been a community that I have had the most difficulty in responding to me and my entreaties to have them on the show to talk about things. I have reached out to the 3 government recognized tribes here in Texas by email and have gotten one response back from their PR company, basically trying to hook me up with somebody to talk to, and that went nowhere after multiple exchanges. I have reached out to the Texas Observer magazine, who's based here in Austin. They just, the last, I think, year and a half or 2 years, the editor-in-chief is actually a Native American man from a tribe not a Texas tribe, but outside of Texas, and he started an indigenous desk, so to speak, at the magazine to bring in light and issues about the indigenous community to the focus of the magazine for, and brought on 2 indigenous reporters, and I've reached out to all of them and none of them have responded. And we've had 2 other reporters from the Texas Observer on our show multiple times to talk about the articles they've written, and I've pointed that out to them and I've yet to get a response from them. We have a person who's of indigenous descent at Co-op Radio a couple of, generations back, and he's got a few light connections. He is apologetic about not being able to connect us with more people, but I find it unusual that I'm having such a hard time bringing out these issues. And it just goes back to some of the comments that were made, I think, for people that in that article that we just read about how Native American, the treatment that we've, inflicted on these people as the colonizers of this country have made them so gun shy about wanting, no pun intended, but about like wanting to talk to us. We've pretty much obliterated our relationship with them. So, and I don't know if that has anything to do with the fact I can't reach anybody to talk to me on the show, but I've been very,
Thank you.
disappointed.
Yeah, it sounds rough. Thank you so much. Cindy. You're still muted.
I realize that. Thank you. I think listening to this and pondering the lack of media attention, I think our whole country is realizing how guilty it should feel. They don't, maybe I think the lack of attention is mostly based on guilt, in that we have destroyed some cultures, and in fact, quite a few diverse, different cultures that had great understanding of the earth and caring for the earth. And here we are polluting the whole world. I think we should be ashamed of ourselves. And so I think we avoid the whole issue because of, if not us directly, then our support for the culture that we're part of. It's a shame.
Thank you, Cindy. Pedro.
Yeah, just first real quickly, I think, Michelle, your inclinations are probably right. That, that article we read is so powerful, and this woman speaks to the issue that she's been afflicted by people that have been murdered and disappeared. Just the traumatization, the trauma itself, to go back and relive it may be an impediment for many of these things. But really, I just wanted to close my comments with an excerpt from this Chinese critique of the US human rights. We're always critiquing every other nation for their human rights. China does a very in-depth 18-page deal. And speaking to this gun issue, they write, quote, "The Washington Post reported on its website, June 19th, 2021, that COVID-19 lockdowns, anti-racism protests, and election strife have led to a record gun sales of about 23 million in 2020, a 64% increase over 2019 sales." It goes on to say that 8 million new first-time buyers of guns, according to this source that they cite, and that 41,500 people died of gun violence in 2020 nationwide. And there were 592 mass shootings nationwide. So just the context, we want to sometimes, as Dr. King said, looking at through the eyes of other nations and evaluating what they say rather than just condemning what they say based on our critique of China is worth looking at if y'all want to check it out. But it came out in March of 2021. Thank you.
Thanks, Pedro. Bill?
It was a depressing article, but it's one that we all need to read. And but the evidence of denial in the comments, one person said, one person said, "Did you read the article? 67% of perpetrators are non-native." And so the reply was, "That didn't sound right to me." So I did a little digging, and it's amazing how people who spend 20 minutes on Google think they're smarter than all the scientists. It's happening with COVID too. But we definitely, I would suggest, Michelle, we found that we learned most about indigenous people in New Mexico and British Columbia. And the people in New Mexico, the Pueblos, were the first ones to successfully defeat the Europeans. And they've had a strong thing there. And the people that we talked to were very open. So just a suggestion.
Thank you.
Thank
Bill.
you, Phyllis, for that eye-opening article.
Thank you. Nora.
I think it's interesting that sporting events and venues get state money for having a sex trafficking plan. Why would there be a need for that at these events and venues that particularly attract men, Formula One race events and such? So really, I'd like to see more effort from the men in charge to combat the violence. That's it.
Thank you, Nora. Marba?
Thank you, Phyllis, for an interesting article, because I would have not done research if it hadn't been for this article. And I just became aware of the Vietnam Act. I do think indigenous people in Vietnamese communities are close, somewhat close, for reasons of protection. It had little media airing time because I was not aware of the Vietnam Act before this article, and I don't believe it passed. I'm going to do more research because it was not known to so many people on this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Marva. Louise?
So there is, I agree, there's very little representation of indigenous people on TV, in the media, you know, the invisibility. But I do believe we can do our own research until that does happen, if it will ever happen. But we can do our own research and get knowledgeable ourselves. And by the way, it is it's more of a light-hearted show, but there is a show that I put in the chat called Reservation Dogs. It's on Hulu, and it does give you a little insight into it. Well, young person's view on living in a reservation. I thought that was interesting. And there was a movie called Smoke. Was it Smoke?
Smoke Signals.
Smoke Signals. Oh my God, that's such a great movie. But anyway, what else was I going to say? I wanted to say something else and I forgot. Never mind. I won't be here next week, unfortunately, but and I might have to leave in about 2 minutes. So bye. Thank you. It was I think we should have more conversations about indigenous people, to be honest.
Thank you. Next, Marla?
Yep, I don't really have a whole lot extra to add, except in my perfect world, I wonder what it would be like if we could summon all white men to get together and, you know, collectively show their care and concern for issues like this, if it would make a difference. You know, I think that's where the power continues to lie. And I mean, I don't feel powerless in what my contribution can be, but I think about it going really deeply into the patriarchal ties of our country and its foundation and how that might make a difference. Thanks. It was an awesome article.
Thanks, Marla.
Enlightening. I wouldn't say awesome. But yeah.
Thank you. Glenn?
Yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't connect with you the first time you called me, but
That's
I
all
was
right.
driving. And you know, I enjoyed the discussion, and by driving I really couldn't engage like I would like to engage into the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, I feel like what Louise's husband said is true, that oftentimes there's topics that don't get as much energy from our discussions. And a lot of the times, not only is it Indigenous or like not a black and white issue, but also involves women or involves trans people or gay people. Those all seem to get a little bit less energy from us. And, you know, we try to bring things, sometimes we want to bring things around to, you know, what we're comfortable talking about. And, you know, the show Reservation Dogs that Louise mentioned, I have watched that. That is very good. And yeah, it's just so much depth to it, even though it's kind of lighthearted. And then it's suddenly not lighthearted. And I think also, you know, that somebody made the statement, we need to make it people's problems. I think women are one of the groups that are most divided away from each other, so that we don't form organizations that make the institutions and the patriarchy in our cultures very uncomfortable and have to make change. And, you know, it's not just white men who benefit from patriarchy, and because all men benefit from it in whatever culture they're from. But I think literally it's because a lot of women sleep with the enemy, and you have to be willing to risk that relationship for maybe your own safety, maybe the safety of the children that you've had with that person, maybe for your relationship with your whole community. It's a tough situation. It's hard for a woman to leave an abuser. And in the Native community, I'm sure there are Native men who benefit from the patriarchy of the settlers, which is not necessarily their own culture to have that sort of patriarchal oppression of women. And in any culture, if there's patriarchy, the male members of that are going to benefit from it, whether they like strongly endorse it themselves or not, they're still benefiting. Just like white people might not want to benefit from racism or white privilege, but we do, you know, and you have to be conscious of it, and you have to fight against it. And I made some other notes. Let me see what else I wrote. Well, I appreciate all the sort of books and topics and the Indian Law Resource Center, that resource, I think that was all really helpful information to get during this conversation. I hope that, you know, we can not be so, this is the thing to be mad about. That's what I want to say. This is the thing to be really, really angry about. And because yes, it's happening to literally the most vulnerable women in our culture, which is, well, Marla brought up Made, the show, which I'm almost finished listening to the book. And I'm glad in the book, the author who reads the book herself does bring up her own privilege and how the life she was living is so much harder for a woman of color. She does have a section where she talks about that. But it is, you know, it's another issue is the poor and how we treat the poor. They're also invisible. in this culture until they're not, until they're at a street corner with a sign and then everybody's all offended. So, you know, we have a lot to fix in our culture and it seems overwhelming. But I hope that we really are able to do it, or frankly, I think we're doomed. That's my cheerful thought for the day. So I'm going to stop the recording and then we'll do the